So welcome to the first book discussion of the International Network for Research in Sport and Migration Issues. Great that so many of you have actually joined us today. It's the first session, so we are happy that all of you are here. And the network is in its 11th year of existence, but for our first book discussion event, we have waited for a special book to be published and discussed here, and that's the Handbook of Sport and Migration, edited by Joseph Maguire, Liston and Mark Falcous, published by Elgar. And I'm happy, or we are all happy, to have the three editors and well-known colleagues here today, which is Joseph Maguire, a professor emeritus at the School of Sport, Exercise and Health Sciences at Loughborough University, UK. Liston, who is a senior lecturer in the social sciences of sport at Ulster University, Northern Ireland, and Mark Falcous, who is an associate professor in the sociology of sport at the University of Otago, New Zealand. A warm welcome to the three of you, Joseph, Katie, and Mark. Great you have made it. Further, we have the privilege to also have two well-known colleagues present who will discuss the handbook today. And that is Carmen Rial. I hope she has rejoined by now. I don't see her, but she will definitely be here in a minute, I think. Carmen, who is professor at the Department of Anthropology at the Federal University of Santa Catarina, Brazil. And also Klein, professor emeritus of anthropology at the Northeastern University in Boston, the US. Also a warm welcome to the two of you and thanks for being here today. My name is Ungruhe from the University of Passau in Germany, and together with Mark, Carmen, Ellen, and also Marie Eng from the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa, I'm running the network since about a year ago. And before we start the book discussion, I want to quickly share some information about the network. If you are a member of the network, you may have experienced some new developments recently, and among them is a new website, including a news and activities section, and also a list of a members list that can be used to connect with colleagues in the field. And you can reach the website under sportmigration.net. I'll put it in the chat in a minute. And just last week, we have created an open mailing list that can be used by members and also interested subscribers to spread the word, for example, about conferences, call for papers, job postings, publications, or also to comment and discuss issues happening in the field of sport migration. And if you are interested in membership or the mailing list, just send me an email. I'll put my email address in the chat so you can reach me. And for the network, our aspiration is actually to stress on interactive participation, encouraging collaboration, and developing research in our field, which is sport and migration. And book discussions will be one of our activities, but also conference panels and possibly our own network conference and publications, maybe in the middle future. And we are happy actually to receive your ideas and suggestions about it. So feel free to get in touch with us and let us know about your ideas for the network. So now it's time to introduce and discuss firsthand the Handbook of Sport, the Handbook on Sport and Migration. And today's procedure will be as follows. So we plan for an overall 90 minutes of input and discussion. And after this short intro, Joseph, Katie, and Mark will give some first-hand editor's insights and talk about the idea, the scope, and the direction of the book, which is followed by external views and discussion by Carmen and Ellen, sorry. And then we'll give the floor to you who have joined the call. And you're welcome to participate with questions to the editors and discussants, or your own inputs for further discussions if you want to. And as I said, and as you have probably noticed, this session is recorded, first of all, for a reason of documentation. But as I said, if it all goes well, we might have think of sharing it widely. But yeah, Katie, you're right. If it doesn't, then it will disappear in the shelf, so don't worry about it. Okay, so let's start with the book discussion. Joseph, Katie, and Mark. So to start the conversation and to go a bit in time, actually, the Handbook on Sport and Migration is technically the first handbook that you have edited on the topic. However, you have edited the Global Sports Arena with John Bale in 1994, Joseph, and the anthology Sport and Migration, Borders, Boundaries, and Crossings with Mark, I think, in 2011. So now what brought the three of you, Joseph, Katie, and Mark, together to edit this current handbook? And what were the key drivers to publish such a handbook or this particular handbook on the topic now, today?
I think that question falls to me in the first instance. Well, you're right, of course, and you've carbon dated me somewhat, that the first book, The Global Sports Arena, was published over 40 years ago. So thank you, Christian, for reminding me. But there had been a decent enough and sufficient gap between that and the second, which was with Mark. And then that was 2011. I could then say, of course, with some persuasion, that I then had an inspiration, or we had the inspiration to publish another. But actually, pragmatically, it was the publishers who contacted us in the first instance as to whether we would want to do a handbook. That was the timing, although the timing wasn't very good. Katie reminded me just a little while ago that, in fact, the timing was the agreement was in 2019. And then, of course, along comes COVID, and, well, the rest is history in that regard. So that took a longer period of time than we would have liked, but that's the sort of sequencing. We thought there'd been enough time which had elapsed between the work which Mark and I had put together in 2011, surveying the field, to then merit a handbook, which would be larger in scope, and in fact larger than the actual final product. There were more invitations to scholars during that period than actually we eventually had in terms of publications, and we perhaps might want to talk about why that was the case. I think actually the inspiration was not simply because the field has expanded, and clearly it has over that 40-year period. There are more people actually researching the topic, number one. There are more people in different parts of the world, in different continents, who are researching the topic. So that's number two. And the eclectic diversity of either not only particular sports or issues, but also theoretical approaches, that also is enlarged over time. I know my colleague and friend Mark will talk about section 4 in particular, and Katie will talk about the structure of the book. But obviously, in addition to that enlargement and expansion, new themes, either which we were not aware of, which reflected our own lack of knowledge, or which genuinely have emerged and surfaced in the last decade, clearly merited much greater attention. And so, as you will see, section 4 of the book, which deals with refugees, asylum seekers, and so on, that wasn't something which was really germane to the 2011 and certainly not the 1994 study. I should just add one qualification as well about the inspiration for the book. The dedication was to John Bale, if anybody who'd noted that in our collection. But the book which John and I edited back then on the global sports arena, actually, there were books already published on migration and sport. They tended to be done in North America, and particularly in the US, by people like Rooney and others, and they tended to come out of the discipline of geography, and they tended to be quite traditional mapping exercises about the flow of movement of college athletes to different parts of the United States, and occasionally to the non-51st state, Canada. So there was that sort of work which was already preceding us. So the inspiration or the initial spark was actually driven by the publisher contacting us. We then thought and reflected. I've already worked with Mark and Katie on other projects. We knew we could work well together, and we thought with the impetus of the field, and of course, knowing the work which a number of the people I'm looking at here would be worthy of reaching out to and trying to draw together a handbook. So I think that probably the way I would briefly begin the process, and maybe hand the baton on to Katie to talk about the structure, if that's okay with you, Christian. Or
we'll come to the structure in a minute. Thanks, Joseph. We'll come to the structure in a minute. But maybe first, Katie and Mark, you could just probably briefly add what was different in the planning of the process, in the process of planning and producing the current handbook. I mean, Joseph, you already talked about issues that happened in the field of sport migration. It expanded, quite vastly, but also probably in academia more generally. That also was important for the production and planning of the handbook.
I'll maybe say one or two things, Christian. And I suppose I'm thinking in particular of what Joe said about the timing. And our original intention, of course, was that this collection would have been published much sooner, but the global pandemic affected us all in very different ways. Probably when I think back to our research process, because we'd worked previously on a different collection, we had, I think it's fair to say, quite a lot of support from that previous publisher, and this was going to be slightly different. So I think the three of us committed from the very outset to make sure that we did as much research as we possibly could to scope the field, for the reasons that Joe just articulated, that undoubtedly there were going to be some authors and topics and newly emerging ideas that we would yet not know about. And probably in some ways the pandemic allowed us some more time to do that, given the significant changes it had on all of our lives. There probably was a flip side, however, to that also, in that, as Joe mentioned, where initially we sent very many invitations, and ideally what we were trying to do was reflect, I suppose, established experts in the field, but also to attract new authors and give them an opportunity that ordinarily wouldn't be available elsewhere. COVID made some of that possible, but possibly not all of it, owing largely to different personal circumstances that would have been connected to that. So I think our research was probably quite extensive. And maybe just to finish on that point, we probably should take the opportunity to thank all of the contributors. I know some are on this call, some are not. They won't have been able to join us, but certainly to thank all of them for their patience and perseverance, because we did encounter, and understandably so, quite a range of different personal and professional circumstances over this time period from 2019 through to 2024. A lot can happen in 5 years. And also to thank Elgar, of course. Probably in the context then of the field itself, the final thing I would say is that one of the most significant changes since the last collection, and this is what we were sensitive to, was the movement of highly skilled human capital, which had increased significantly in terms of scale, pattern, and composition, notably including women as sports migrants since that last collection that Joe mentioned. So we were attuned to that, especially, and hoping that we could include more of that research.
Okay, great. Yeah. COVID-19 and book writings, I also can tell a story of my own or our own, but yeah, actually great that we managed to publish books, and especially yours. And Joseph, you already mentioned that you wanted to talk about the structure of the book. You're welcome to do so now. So I just give a brief overview. It's divided in 4 parts named Sporting Mobilities, Continuity and Change. Then second, sporting spaces, places and identities. 3, governance, regulation and boundaries. And concluded by 4, immigration, refugees and control. So while titles or subtitles often speak for themselves to some degree, probably you can, in a nutshell, explain what the parts cover and what was the reason behind this formulation of this structure.
Do you want to take the lead, Katie, or shall I say something in?
Well, we can have a good relay team going in case I miss something. I suppose, as I mentioned, Christian, in fact, our original intention was to have 5 sections, which would have reflected a broader scope. But of course, there are some limitations that we all have to manage. I mean, typically a handbook of this sort would be pitched by any publisher as an expansive piece of work, ranging from between, well, I guess it depends on the publisher, maybe 20 chapters through to maybe 30 or 35, roughly 200,000 words. So we did try to meet that brief as much as we could. And so one of our decisions, as we negotiated with those who were willing and able and had capacity to make the contribution, was how best to reflect the range of research topics and the locations of authors from around the world, especially those that ordinarily might not be included. So when we did get all of those contributions together, we felt that we wanted to try to reflect some of the dominant disciplines in the first section, which was part 1, which is why it's titled Continuity and Changes. So broadly speaking, reflecting the disciplines of geography, sociology, sport management, and anthropology. I think we would have preferred, and we mentioned this earlier when we were discussing our reflections, we would have preferred probably more contributions from political science, but that wasn't feasible owing to some of the circumstances of those that we invited. Part 2 then pays a little bit more attention to sporting spaces, places and identities. And probably given what Joe said earlier, parts 1 and 2 demonstrate probably a little bit more continuity with those first 2 collections in 94 and 2011. Part 3 deals with more of the, I guess, perpetual issues that you would typically see arise in any discussion about migration, and of course, sport migration within that, which is governance, regulation and boundaries. And probably since the very early writing on sport migration, there have been significant changes in the transnational labour market. And certainly there's far more that we can say now by way of comparisons between the highly skilled in other occupations and elite sport migrants. And part 4, I guess we were particularly excited to be able to include new research around, immigrations, refugees, transnationalism, which hopefully we believe reflects a broadening of the field, because it was a real pleasure to be able to peer review some of the work that was dealing with key debates around refugees and forced migration in particular.
Just to add to it, of course, it would be lovely for us to say we had a master plan, we stuck to it, and we made no modifications. That would be highly misleading. What we found is, of course, yes, in fact, we had 5 sections, and some of you who are on the call may well have received the original letter, and the section which we perhaps invited you to may have changed. I'm trying to identify which people are where. So as a consequence of that, the editorial process evolved. and it always does in relation to whether people are unavailable or sometimes people don't deliver. In those instances, then in the light of which we had to adapt and modify, not only one section being removed, but in addition to which the titles of the sections, we tried to obviously reflect that which we wanted to highlight, but also reflect that which we had received from various authors, some of which reflected the invite, and some of which, of course, people chose to take a different slant to that which we thought they might have been doing. So there's always in that editorial process a bit of navigating and negotiation. Katie made the observation, which is correct. The first two sections probably reflect the legacy of the past to a greater degree. That is, that the work which has been done, reflected in the 211 and or the 94, those themes still are at work and people are still researching in those areas. And that's as it should be. Sections 3 and 4. 4 is obviously much newer, as both Katie and I have mentioned. And number 3 might be something we would want to come back to. And I think there's at least one, possibly two of you who are on the call who are in section 3. There we drew together a number of different contributors around the issue of governance and regulation. And I don't know whether eventually, Christian, we're going to talk about what would come next, but I do believe that governance and regulation in a broader and wider sense about power, culture, and control probably is a future area which needs to be enlarged and investigated more fully.
Yeah, we'll definitely talk about the future. But let me first also stress on what you've just mentioned, some first-hand insights into the negotiations of planning and making the book. I mean, being an editor of such a volume comes probably with very responsibilities that you have to follow. For example, including the diversity of authors and making authorship reflecting border, locations, gender, having all kinds of topics reflected that are relevant in the field. So do you remember some controversial discussions among the three of you that took place of what shall be in and what shall not be in? And then maybe following from this, what are you most happy about that made it into the book? And maybe also unhappy of something that it didn't make it to the book, sorry.
Katie, do you want to share
I'll say one or two things, Christian. Yeah, and then I'll hand over. Just on the responsibilities of an editor, as we mentioned, we've worked together on previous collections. Some of you on the call might know that. So we had already established a good working relationship and a set of work patterns, Christian, which meant that we could put a lot of trust in each other to research widely, in other words, but we had to also ensure that we met on a regular basis to review some of that work and what we were finding, and to try to ensure that we did retain some of our principles around a wide scope and a range of topics and so on. I have to say I had to endure Mark and Joe's eulogizing about the golden age of Loughborough on a regular basis, but I did manage to survive it. I certainly was interested in ensuring that we reflected the growth in interest, maybe not yet in research terms, but certainly the growth in interest in women as sports migrants. So we did very consciously reach out to a range of authors around the world, some from different gendered backgrounds, but who were working in that space. I would have preferred, I think, to have more contributions in that space, but owing to some of the circumstances that we've alluded to, that wasn't always possible. I can give you some examples of why that might have been. We encountered authors who experienced very serious illness, who had to withdraw perhaps at a late basis. We had authors who were not only changing jobs, but were actual migrants themselves. They were changing countries. We were navigating different times of the academic year. What was, if I use a sporting phrase, what was in season for us as editors, or indeed only one or two of us as editors might have been out of season for somebody else. And of course, there were language barriers, but we did very consciously reach out to those who were working in other countries in different time spans to try to ensure that we met some of those interests. I think Joe or Mark might maybe want to say one or two other things also about other research topics that we would like to have included in our reflections on that as well.
Mark, do you want to?
A good time for me to chime in. Hello to everyone on the call, and thanks to Christian for putting this together. I think my recollection of those early phases really, your responsibility and your process is to really scan the field and make sure that the collection really is a representation of the breadth of what's going on in the field. And so that was, what our early process was about, and there was lots of discussions back and forth to try and really get geographical breadth and breadth of context as far as different sporting contexts, and then different, breadth of sort of different paradigmatic theoretical approaches. So I think that's what really, to my mind, drove those early conversations, and we really wanted to do our best to capture as far and wide what was going on in the field, what was out there, and that the collection would reflect that. And like both Katie and Joe have really captured. Of course, then there's a pragmatic set of things going on around what makes it in, what can make it in, and a whole logistical issues and range of issues for various people who you want to invite and ask in and so forth. From my perspective, the one of the things about this collection, it kind of relates to it really was a follow-on from the Sport and Migration collection from 2011 that Joe and myself worked on, and an expansion and a broadening of that. And what was obvious in that sort of 13-year span from between the two books was really reflected in section 4, which was the growth of that area of research around what you might call non-sporting driven migrations, and movements and mobilities and immobilities around forced migration and so forth, refugees, etc. So that was very much reflected in, of course, section 4 as something that was differentiated, and that was definitely representing a broadening of the field in quite useful ways, and introducing sort of new frames of reference and different sort of things as far as theorizations, conceptualizations that were new to the field. So yeah, they're my thoughts on that process and what we were trying to do, and we probably have done it imperfectly in relation to trying to scan as far and wide as possible. I think we were trying to be as rigorous as we could. There was always some things probably perhaps would have slipped the net, but then really trying to capture that breadth and the whole presence of the field was really what I think a handbook needs to achieve. So that was, I think, the driver of those early phases, and you can all be judges of how well we achieved that. But that was really the kind of key impetus in that.
We'll ask Alan and Carmen for some critical reflection on that. But thanks.
Yes.
So
the only other thing I would add, of course, as Mark has alluded to, there are case studies of different sports in different parts of the world conducted either by people from those parts of the world or elsewhere. You can only, of course, capture to whatever degree you're able to that which is. Over the course of time from 94 to 11 and then to the most recent book, on the one hand, there is both a growth in knowledge, an expansion of perspectives, but at the same time, there's also sometimes a contraction of theoretical perspectives. In other words, some perspectives which were more popular at one point become less so and are superseded, rightly or otherwise, by others. This may surprise some of you, the fact that I'm sure a number of you may be familiar with my own theoretical approach. But what I would long for is actually classical Marxism to actually re-emerge and to be dealing with the capture of global sports federations by different political and geopolitical interests. And in addition to which, those sort of questions of power, culture, control, which in the section on governance and regulation, if those sorts of papers do exist, I apologize in advance that we didn't put them in. But that would be something I would, think it becomes even more pressing as time goes on.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah, particularly in the current climate, calling for Marxist approaches. I mean, we're still in academia, so we can still do that. No, fair enough. I would be actually very happy to see that. And if you are out there working on sport migration from a Marxist perspective, give Joseph a call. You will be happy to receive it for the next handbook. But actually, the three of you mentioned that the book covers a variety or a range of topics, themes, also approaches, locations also a range of disciplines. You mentioned that sociology, of course, then anthropology, geography. Also, I saw law and management appearing there. However, while the three of you are situated in sociology. So in how far is this handbook a sociological contribution or a contribution for the discipline of sociology? And where does it go beyond it?
Who wants to go first on that one?
Do you want to go, Joe?
Yeah, you see, I wouldn't accept that I'm simply a sociologist. Yes, that's the discipline which my PhD is in. Process thinking, figurational work, actually would seek to go beyond the categories of academia in terms of disciplinary boundaries. So time-space analysis would intersect with geography, history, sociology, psychology. So the human sciences more broadly, if you will. We're getting to a bigger debate, I hasten to add, and I probably should rein back. At worst, you could call me a sociological historian or a historical sociologist. But it's no surprise that when first John Bale and myself got together, John was a geographer of an old school variety, but immediately we understood each other in terms of how and in what ways we could understand this phenomena of the movement of people across different time zones and different time periods, and across different either regions or continents or hemispheres. It was only later that John becomes much more, he himself went on a intellectual journey where he developed into the type of work he eventually did in terms of postmodern geography or postmodern thinking, if you will. So I wouldn't say that this is just a sociological contribution. And indeed, we've tried to include people who are of different disciplines. But I'll pass the baton over to the other two to put their own spin on it as well.
I chime in there, Katie. Yeah, I echo Joe's comments. I see it as multidisciplinary, and my training, I guess, was in sociology, but very much sort of cross-disciplinary approaches. And I think if you look at the collection, there is a breadth of different fields and different theoretical theorizations. I mean, there's everything from the very last chapter is really a sort of legal studies, law focused kind of approach, as well as post-colonial theory, various elements of geography, and so on. So I see it very much as a multidisciplinary set of perspectives rather than just sort of leaning into sociology.
You want to add on that, Katie?
No, I agree. I agree
Okay.
entirely, Christian. Yep.
Yeah, fair enough. Maybe we can also take that point up in the discussion with the participants. But I actually then want to build up on this. So an inter or transdisciplinary approach is definitely important, I would agree. But what does such an approach help us to look at sports migration from various disciplines? What does it help us to understand contemporary social and political issues beyond sport? First and foremost, in our field, migration issues. I mean, is that relevant for us? Do we want to contribute to general migration studies, or to also contribute to issues that are situated, yeah, in the political sphere of migration, or are we simply sport migrant scholars who want to add to our field?
I think that's a question that can probably spark a lot more discussion than we have time for today, Christian, and it will be great to see how the members of this network, address that themselves. Certainly, as Mark and Joe said, our intention was to reflect a range of approaches. I mean, one of the things about expertise, and particularly about interdisciplinary expertise, is that those who can move to that space probably most quickly are already experts. So I think what we've tried to do here, given both the breadth of topics and locales around the world, and also the scholars at different stages of their careers, is allow that platform to be there in this third collection. And of course, there are some on this call that have already worked in that interdisciplinary space, probably more than others. So I think I agree with you if you're saying that there are some benefits to be able to look to better interdisciplinary work. I mean, in my own example, and I know one of my colleagues is here who's contributed to one of the chapters, I'm working in what's now called a sport and exercise science department, spanning the biosciences and the social sciences. And in the middle of that, we have a discipline that is something like, for example, what's called sports management. So I think more and more of us who were potentially trained either in sociology or by sociologists can see that we have to be able to apply our skills in a much broader way, in a sense. And indeed, some of the other contributors who might have had some training in sociology are working in the field. So I can think of one or two authors on the call also who are actually working in professional sport, who are using those ideas in a much more practical or applied fashion. I think probably the last thing I would say is that we are trying to capture the growth in the field, research both in terms of sports migration in and of and on in many ways. So sport in migration and sports migration itself. And what was interesting about the timing of the release of our collection was there was also another handbook released. I think Joe and Mark, we mentioned this at the time, which was a handbook on the sociology of migration, Christian, which is why it springs to mind for me, because you asked about this. And of course, we would see sport as a lens through which to investigate these broader issues. So absolutely, we don't see this as a niche field. We see it as contributing much more broadly to what we would call, I suppose, migration studies.
We have to, and I know there's at least two former PhD students of mine on the call. We have to get out of the ghetto. By that I mean is any study of sport which is not a study of the society in which it's located is a study out of context. So to address your point, Christian, let's go back to Pierre Bourdieu. I mean, Bourdieu's point on sport and social class was that we are both, and I'm talking specifically of sociology, but Alan Klein could weigh in here with regard to anthropology, and there are other scholars from different disciplines. The mainstream tends to either neglect the study of sport because it's seen as low status and trivial, or they discover it and as if they have suddenly become Newtonian, in that they have discovered a field which apparently is virgin and no one ever has actually done any research on. That's on the one side. And on the other side of the coin is that we're despised by sport because, of course, you ask awkward, problematic questions. And either side for Bourdieu, of course, it was, and for him as a mainstream sociologist of high status himself, that was a difficult path for him to navigate. So it's a path for young PhD students and for, established academics to also in this area to negotiate. But you should certainly see that the contribution you're making is both to the applied side, if that can make a difference in the lives of the people who you're researching on the one hand, to the subdisciplinary area, whether that's migration and sport, but also to migration studies more broadly, because of course, we have a wonderful opportunity in situ to see the dynamics which are at work, which are specific to this area, but also which are generalizable. And I think that's a contribution, any advice to younger scholars, I would say, is that both publish in the subdisciplinary areas, but also publish, in the mainstream journals. But be aware of the fact that the advice which Bourdieu also referred to.
Okay. Anything to add? Otherwise, we can pick it up for further discussion afterwards. Mark?
No. I mean, I think Katie and Joe have really captured. Just one comment I will make, just reflecting on an earlier part of the discussion, in terms of sort of thinking about our field and what it's constituted. Yeah, I think you do have to recognise that if you look at the sport migration literature that's out there, I think, and I'm pulling this figure out of my head, I think probably between 60 and 70% of it deals with association football. There's a skew. There's a skew. If we were to represent in a collection the breadth of the field as it exists, then that would skew that way. So it's interesting thinking about the composition of the collection, because you're always sort of conscious of that and trying to push beyond that breadth. And in terms of I would echo what my colleagues have said in terms of broader contributions beyond the immediate field, because that's a bigger philosophical kind of question and issue that we wrestle with every day, right? Our relevance beyond the immediate kind of world in which we might be having dialogue, and that this collection is no different in that regard. Yeah, that's my thoughts there.
Okay, great. And that already takes us to some future thoughts. I mean, you have already mentioned here and there that some topics and approaches that you wanted to work on or see people work on in the coming years. But now, before we come to Carmen's and Elliot's input in a minute, it's now maybe your chance for the time being. Think of about what 8, 10 years when the next handbook is on the horizon. What do you want to see in it? What your current handbook has probably paved the way for, or not?
It should be a handbook without my name on. That's first and foremost. I meant that seriously, not just in a humorous way. In other words, that you have to pass the baton on, and of course, let 1,000 flowers bloom. So that's the first point. Nevertheless, you see. Go back to C. Wright Mills. We need to study the power elite in relation to sport migration to a greater degree. It's always tempting, and quite rightly so, that we want to hear the voices of the marginalized, and that's important, don't get me wrong. But I think the more I see what's at work, whether it's FIFA or IOC, or for those of you less familiar with the sport of cricket, that what is at work in terms of cricket and the IPL, franchise movements in different parts of the world, and so on and so forth. We need actually to be more adept at being able to, in an anthropological sense, I'm teasing my friend Alan here, to be able to immerse ourselves in the power elite. We need to actually see what's at work. We need to be more adept at seeing how there's a conjunction of interest with different parties and which control the regulation and governance of migration, in this case, more generally, but also of sport in particular. That would be something if I wasn't doing the work with Katie on Irish-British history, that might be something I would be tempted to do myself.
And if I had all the research money in the world, I'd do exactly what Joe said, which is hang out in all these hotels at all the top IOC meetings and try and wheedle my way into the power elite and tell you all the inside story. But we don't. So,
but it will require, in all seriousness, and the anthropologists amongst you will know this, is that it requires, depending on what your own background is and the assumptions you have, and baggage we all bring with us to the table, or in this case to the field, being able to see and to feel comfortable within such networks would be, very important to get that both involved and yet detached perspective. But I'll throw that out I'm tempting Alan already on that bait, but we'll see where we go with it.
Just some thoughts on that topic from myself. I think what I would hope is that theory and method, always needs to adapt and accommodate to contemporary circumstance so that we can understand the world as it is around us. And that's, of course, shifting and changing. We're in an age of protectionism and the aggressive assertion of national boundaries right now, mercantilist approaches to economies, and that will always have reflections in and through sports context. So you would hope that, of course, scholars are going to rise to that challenge in terms of, generating and using tools around them, creating new creative approaches that can understand those contexts. And the other thing, and we've had a lot of discussions about this as a group of editors, is really the gendered global sporting system, and we are in a point of shift and transition and flux in that regard. So we need perspectives that can account for the new political economy of women's sport, for example, and the way in which that's intersecting in a whole variety of complicated ways the broader global sporting system. And so I would hope that we start to get work that maps out the new complexities and also the new and unique circumstances that throws up that we haven't seen in previous reflected in previous research. So I think you just anticipate a dynamism to the field, and you hope that creative approaches emerge to make sense of what's going on and swirling around us on a day-to-day basis in terms of different political, economic, socio-cultural trajectories to capture all of those complexities.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I think very interesting ideas for the futures. Joseph, I hope, while I totally underline your plea for anthropology, I hope you rethink your in non-involvement in the next major contribution to the field. Right, that's great. Good. So we can, of course, pick some of these points up in the broader discussion with the audience. But let's first move to some inputs from our discussants, who are Carmen and Alan. And let me open the discussion with the two of you with the question of, what do you think, Alan and Carmen? What was most fascinating, and what were you most happy about when reading this book in a critical manner?
Does Carmen want to go first?
You can go first.
Me? Well, a couple of things. I mean, the area that I originally agreed to limit my conversation to was the area of agency, and I enjoyed picking some of the articles. Of course, many of the articles referred to agency, but I picked several that I wouldn't mind talking more about. But the big surprise for me, because it just happened to coincide with what I've been doing. I just finished a book. You can call it an autoethnography, but it's really, it's created out of my own. It's very autobiographical, and in that book, the dominant theme was I'm an immigrant and I'm a refugee at the same time. I was born in a DP camp after World War II. My family stayed in Germany for 5 years, and then we eventually migrated to the U.S. And I as a 5-year-old was really just an immigrant and refugee, and so the section, the fourth section, really intrigued me a lot, and actually gave me a lot of ideas for future things, both sport and non-sport related. For me, the issue of being all refugees are immigrants, and every one of those refugees, whether they're adults or children, they're both fleeing from something as a refugee and fleeing to something as an immigrant. And the immigrant is the optimist. The refugee is fearful. And those two play out through people's lives, throughout the course of their lives. Even as an old man, I'm still sort of dealing with those two kind of Janus-faced archetypes in my life. And so that section in the handbook was really a surprise for me. And it's something I think I'll take up in the future. So that's one idea. But for me, the issue of agency and how people in the handbook dealt with agency was also an intriguing thing. In anthropology, we really have been dealing with the idea of, well, we call it now agency, but 40, 50 years ago, it was considered resistance, and a lot of cultural resistance studies came out, but they were essentially the same kind of thing. And Joe talked about the idea of studying the power elite and lessening our interest in studying down. Anthropologists have always studied down, right? And it was Laura Frater, the anthropologist, and sister of Ralph Nader. She said we have to study up, and she made that call back in the 70s, and we've never been able to study up adequately, and there's a reason for it, in part because those bastions of power are almost impossible to penetrate effectively. I remember years ago at NAS when Sugden and Tomlinson would come there and try to talk about their efforts to penetrate into the halls of FIFA and how difficult it was. Difficult is not even the word. It's basically almost impossible, and it's gotten worse as the money has gotten bigger. And so, I worked with Major League Baseball for 40 years, and the book I did in the 2005 or whenever on globalization in baseball, my attempt was, after 20 years of studying the game through various Major League Baseball clubs, that I had some kind of credibility to get into the Major League Commissioner's office. And in fact, I had none. I could not get close to the commissioner's office. The only thing that saved me was I went around back to to Major League Baseball International, which was the marketing division, and I was able to get into that door. And as a result, I was able to do my globalization work. But it's impossible. And as the price or the value of these major league clubs or football clubs in Europe move on up and get bigger and bigger. Boston Celtics just sold for over $6 billion last week. And those places that were once possibly a little open to you increasingly close. It's very hard to get into those organizations at all anymore. And if you do, it's only primarily as a result of you having something to offer them. So, for example, I worked with the Los Angeles Dodgers starting in the late 80s. And when I first attempted to move in and talk with the general manager, Fred Clare of that organization, I gave him a great pitch. It was an academic pitch. I had lots of things that I thought were of value to them. And I did my little shtick. And in the course of it, he's looking at me. I could tell he wasn't paying any attention. And in the course of it, I happened to mention culture shock. Now, culture shock to all of us is just a throwaway term. We just, it's just like something we just casually throw away. He said, "Stop. What is that? What is that thing you just said?" Right? And I realized that everything else I had said that I thought was of value to the organization was not of value. But that idea of culture shock, which was a watered down term, was of value to them. So, the idea that you could kind of maneuver your way into it directly, it's whatever they find in your presentation that might trigger some need for them. They were interested in culture shock because they had migrants coming up from the Dominican Republic and Venezuela who were not reaching fruition and who were essentially wasting capital because they had invested in them and they were self-destructing, right? Having said that, that's kind of a lengthy lead into some of my comments about agency. And I don't know if you want me to just mention some of the aspects of the handbook that I found of value in regard to that, or we should maybe move on to Carmen before we go back to that if you want, however you want to do it.
Yeah, maybe Carmen can add something, and then you can both share your views on on some cross-cutting themes that you have identified.
Okay. I will do the contrary of Alan Klein. I'm not going to talk about something that I found fascinating because of my work, but it's actually because I haven't worked on it. And that was a chapter on mental health, for instance. I thought it was very interesting to see that this was present in the book because this is a central issue in sports, but it's just recently that people are talking about. And admitting a mental issue, maybe it's not talked because it put masculinity at risk. And Darby's chapter, he talks about successful professional football that is often linked to expression of hypermasculinized identities rather than academic achievement. And well, I found some common points with the research I did with Brazilian footballers that emigrate. They do have issues with mental health, but they talk rather about using a religious category. They talk about living abroad as a sacrifice. They do not express it as a health issue. And it's not any medicine that will help them in their thinking, but it's more like meeting other players in religions rituals. Why it is a sacrifice? Well, this is well explained throughout all chapters. Living abroad, it's not easy. And I got a lot of complaints about missing the jokes in the local room. That is, if you do not master the language, you miss, and you think they are talking and laughing about you. And that's something that can lead to religions practice if they try to find a way out of it, but sometimes to abuse of alcohol. I also found very fascinating all the chapters about China. I didn't know a lot about China. But talking about the looking up in anthropology that Alan Klein mentioned, and also Joseph Maguire talk about, yeah, it's true that in the U.S. Anthropology, it was something that came out in the 70s. But in Brazil, we do have a very developed urban anthropology, and we have lots of works that looked up. And this is since in the 70s, or even before this famous article published in US. And in my own research, for instance, I started talking with players that came back from abroad in Brazil. And once I met an American anthropologist, very famous, who wrote a book on Hollywood. And I asked her, well, I read your book, it's very interesting, but why you didn't interview any of the actors? And he said, as if I was the most naive person in the world, but we cannot get interviews with them. It's very hard to get them. And I was challenged by this statement. And I said, how come an anthropologist that can go to the middle of the jungle and interview indigenous people cannot get to famous celebrities players? So I shift my focus to the celebrity players, the Brazilian players who were in Europe. Of course, it was another time. I agree with you. It had been changements in the way we can approach them. But I did talk to many players in Europe, in global clubs. I interviewed more than 15 national players of the national team. And I also did it with others that were not so famous in Morocco, in Thailand, wherever they went. But it is possible, I think. It's just the way you get to them, no? I always, it's not easy, and it's not so hard. If you stay at the parking lot, you might be able to approach them. I never did that. I always went through the club structure, through the press manager or directors for the first approach. And then they gave me the telephone. I could talk with their wives, visit their homes. Well, so it is possible. And FIFA, we had a very good book about FIFA, did by a Brazilian that's called Luis. He's now in Washington doing a sabbatical year there. And he went there, he proposed a project. So I think anthropologists should, I agree that with Maguire when he said that we should look up. Yes, we do. We should try to get to the elites. I don't know, should I go on, Christian?
Yeah, maybe I interrupt you shortly. Yeah, I think that the topic of studying elites, is something that we'll definitely will look into because it will become more important, also probably due to the current climate. From an anthropological point of view, I want to add that while doing ethnography and doing interviews, well, that's a different thing, right? I mean, we can do interviews with elites, right? But doing an ethnography in the FIFA board, that is really hard to pursue. But probably the power of a network and joint forces could help.
We had a president, João Avalanche, who changed the FIFA scene, and he's approachable.
And Alan, you are muted. Alan, we can't hear you.
Can you hear me? What I really meant was, I don't mean getting, like you pointed out, Christian, I'm not talking about getting interviews with players or interviews with the commissioner of National Basketball Association or anything else. I'm talking about being invited into board meetings and getting into our structure itself, which was next to impossible 30, 40 years ago, now is even less likely. You can be creative and you don't have to be stymied completely. I'm sure Sugden and Tomlinson figured out other ways of getting in. I moved around to various other aspects of Major League Baseball and got the information I needed. But we don't have the cachet, the capital to get into the interior, the inner sanctum of those organizations. That's my point. That is not that you can't get interviews. I can get an interview with Stern or Silber or anybody in the MLB's organization with no time at all. It's just that you're getting an interview. You can't confuse an interview with getting into the political elite. And I'm not saying that, I mean, I agree completely with Joe, and I'd like to be in on your next Marxist analysis because I've dusted off my dissertation already, which was a Marxist analysis. Yeah, we absolutely should. It's just that we have to understand that there are certain places we're not going to be invited, and we have to be creative in terms of how we go and get our information.
I think I absolutely agree. It is a challenge. I don't think it's the preserve only of any one discipline, even though I was teasing about anthropology. That wasn't perhaps appropriate. But the strategies would be, for example, and some of the work Katie and I have been involved in, archival research. I would actually make a plea, by the way, for fellow Europeans. We should actually, those who are still part of the European Union, that is, it should be a requirement that sporting federations, associations should, under EU law, here's one for us, should not only preserve documents of the past. The Swimming Association, for instance, based in Lausanne, got rid of all of their historical documents. I happened to turn up only a year too late, as one example. But in addition to which, the sorts of strategies which the IOC or FIFA have adopted, whereby increasingly the documents which become sub judice, for a period of time, seems to be enlarging or growing. So there are strategies as an academic community within Europe, but also in different parts of the world we can adopt. But we can also of the avenues which we can identify. There are within such organizations, whether it's WADA or elsewhere, there are also those who have been in executive positions who become disaffected. And it's those who may wish to talk as well. And so we can get insights. I agree, having gone to FIFA in, I don't know, over 25 years ago, being brought into the inner sanctum, and they almost felt that I had to turn native. You'll excuse the sort of phraseology, and that I was to become a member of the FIFA family. Whereas I was trying, of course, to maintain my degree of detachment, but I was brought to the contracts, which were the library of research which was available to us. It was myself and a colleague, David Stead, and there was just simply rolled out in front of us was all of the material which we didn't have time to do. I doubt whether they would ever allow us to do that now, and besides which it's probably all automated, in terms of computerized. On the other hand, just as a different example, having gone down to the International Ice Hockey Federation, which was also, in Zurich, and I did, it was a Swedish general secretary, and I was trying to butter this guy up, trying to cool the mark out, trying to speak Swedish to the guy, make him feel at home, or me at home with him, and so forth. I was getting absolutely nowhere with the interview. And then he simply, towards the end, said, "So what is it that you want?" And I said, "Well, actually, what I'm interested in is the movement of players in terms of migration to different parts of." He said, "Why didn't you say that?" And he simply moved from one table to the other, and he went on to his computer. FIFA, by the way, which was much wealthier, it was non-computer based. It was just paper archives. And this guy, he said, "So what sort of time period did you want?" And I had to think quickly, what is it that I really wanted? And he simply produced the data for me, and he went to next door and he just brought back a big ream of paper, and there it was. So sometimes it is serendipity, isn't it? A very bad interview going nowhere ends up with something, as opposed to the FIFA crowd who thought I was going to be part of the FIFA family, and then you end up, well, you did see some high-profile contracts, which perhaps now you'd never see, and I agree with what Alan has said. But I think we have to find multiple strategies, and we will be frustrated. We will be knocked back. We will be told that there's no chance and that, you're not wanted. But that shouldn't stop us trying.
Right.
Yeah, I think we should sometimes have mediators. The World Cup organization in Brazil in 2014 was a good example. I had a PhD student who happens to be present in the organizing committee because he was a military, and they want his input on violence in protection for the World Cup. And I happen to know the ambassador of, now she's working in Madrid, who led the commission, the diplomacy commission in this, also in this organizing committee. So I was not present there, but through their thoughts and views, I could get access of what was going on in the organizing committee for the World Cup of 2014. Mediator sometimes helps.
Okay, I think there are ways and approaches to actually make this research happen. We will look forward then in the coming years and to the coming handbook whether it was successful. But we can pick up this conversation towards the end of the event today, I think. But Carmen and Alan, I want to give you the chance to also elaborate on cross-cutting themes. You mentioned agency, Alan, and you said gender, Carmen, to have some few words about that before we open the discussion for everyone.
Okay. Well, I mean, there is other things that I would like to point out as very interesting in the book. The use Oh, it's very hard to say that in English. Intersectionality. And that deals also with, it was present in more than one chapter, the idea that you have to analyze not only class, as Marxism predicts, but also race, age, gender, etc. But gender, Christian, was not a point, something that was present in every chapters. Unfortunately, I was very glad to see the Cine Agegard chapter, because she was the one who dealt directly with gender. And I mean, it's such an important topic, gender and sexuality, no? Because if migration creates contact zone, if we talk in terms of Mary Pratt's concept, it is different depending on whether we are talking about man or woman, cis or trans, homo or hetero. And Richard Gillianot reminds us, women have been playing football since the early days. It's been a sport for both elite women, like in Brazil, or female workers, like the players of the famous Dick Care ladies, the workers of the Scottish factory, no? For men, football reinforces socially prescribed masculinity and acts like a shield against unwanted feminization. It supports hierarchies and heteronormativity, view of gender, rooted in a hegemonic masculinity, no? If you take the concept of Connell, no? But for women, I think playing football opened up possibilities beyond traditional norms of female submission. So I see football as a gender technology, as Teresa Lauretti's terms. No, the sport instills socially acceptable behaviors in men while restricting them for women. No? And feminists fought for women's right to play since the 20s, when there was this discussion with medical and hygienists challenging the feminists were challenging the medical opinions and was seeing football as an essential to feminist liberation. And I think that in places where football was prohibited for a long time, and it is the case in many places in Europe, it's the case in Brazil, with a little difference. In England, for instance, the ban came from the Federal Association. Here it came from the central government during Getúlio Vargas, a dictator, no? Even though there was this prohibition that in Brazil lasted 40 years, it was lifted only in 1979, women continued to play. And football for women can be seen as a subversive act. Now, if we use Jody Butler's terms, it carries the potential to reshape gender norms. And so that's why I love to see more discussion on gender in the other chapters. No, we know that nowadays there is a feminization of migration flows that is present in other chapters. And that's also happening in football, with women's leagues growing everywhere. but there is still a lack of focus on women as skilled migrants in general and in the sport system. As we read in the Sinis chapter, this trend started in the 60s, but that doesn't mean women were absent before, no? Men's transnational migration in sport and elsewhere has always had the support of a family, essentially women. C'est-à-dire, even when women were not themselves migrants, they support men in their process of migration. No? So I think the Agegard and Chisler book in 2014 is still a very important reference. And I fully support their call to make gender, and I would add sexuality, a more central element of research in sport and immigration, alongside with other topics like class, age, education, ethnicity, or religion. No? And I think Katie said something in the presentation of the book too, that she would love to see more gender in the book. Earlier research by Cini categorized migration as moving for the love of the game. I think that the recent restructuring of women's football and the growing importance of the sector might bring similar motivation as for men. I mean, it's not only for the love of the game now. The motivations are similar of the men who are migrating. No, and well, Darby quoted Besnier ERC project on sport and masculinity, and when I talk about gender, I include men, of course, and masculinity. So how we do the migratory experience differ between men and women? This is one question that I would like to see approached. Now, my own research found significant difference. Sexuality and religion had a huge impact on their value, ethos, and cosmology, which are clearly expressed in Brazil, particularly in the vote for the far right or its rejection. Men voted for Bolsonaro. When I talk about men, I'm talking about the Brazilian football players that emigrated. It's not the case of women. They did not divulgate Bolsonaro's vote and was against them. Maybe because many of them were lesbians, and Bolsonaro, as Trump and all these far-right conservatives, are against LGBT communities now. Well, on gender, that was what I would like to say. On the political aspect of the book, I completely agree with Joseph Maguire. Now, when he said, and I finished with this one quote of him, that the 2020s appear to be troubled times. Yes, very troubled. Perhaps the issue of hostility or friendship or of a real politic or ethically based approach should also help frame how we make sense of a nation state's foreign policy stance on sport and migration more generally. The idea of studying governmentability, and Foucault is a reference in this field. I think it's very important. Also, it will touch security, surveillance society and staged as laboratory of surveillance, etc., etc.
Okay, thanks, Carmen. Great insights. I think that gave us also food for the broader discussion. We actually don't have a lot of time left. So, Alan, do you want to talk about the theme of agency in the chapters, or we just open up the discussion now for everyone?
You can open it.
We can open it. That's great. So here's the chance for you. Thanks that most of you are still here. So to also give your thoughts, reflections about the book, ask Joseph and Mark questions. Katie has unfortunately already had to leave, but so the floor is open. Just raise your hand, or we are not many, just chip in. If there are no questions, then Alan, you can elaborate on your theme if you want to.
I've been held back just for that purpose, just in case there was a dead spot. Now you can bring me right in here.
Actually, with the 90 minutes are already up, so but go ahead.
Yeah, no, I've always been drawn to the idea of agency because, you know, as an anthropologist, we've been dealing with resistance or agency or some component around those in that area for decades, as long as I've been in the field. And it's very closely related to the idea of precariousness. Absolutely, they're kind of linked as two sides of the same coin. Joe, in his chapter in the book, talks about agency from a structural perspective and he mentions things like labor rights agency in the context of labor rights and unions, and also of sports organizations creating what they think is agency or opportunity in the context of quota systems. And I was just in Berlin recently and talking to a group of Canadians and Americans who are playing over there now, and they said that this particular year was extremely difficult to come to Europe to play because it was one of those years where various national basketball organizations were not opening up the quotas to North Americans the way they had in the past because they were emphasizing local talent. And Joe's wrote about this decades ago, and that's an ongoing kind of thing. So opportunity on the local scene means the lack of opportunity elsewhere. And so from the perspective of North American players, this cut into their ability to forge a living abroad. And from the perspective of German players, it was an opportunity. So I always think you have to think of precarity and agency as interrelated in that context. I thought most of the articles I looked at that mentioned that it was kind of limited. Sheeter's piece talked about limited agency in Fiji. The Qatari piece basically denied there was any agency. It was so difficult for migrants to break into Qatari society. But I thought Adams, Darby, and Liston's piece on Irish footballers was interesting because it brought up some pieces that I've been dealing with also, which is the idea of releasing players. Usually we think of players that are released from at the end of their career where they're no longer being used, they cease to exist, and that they kind of disappear into a void. I followed this in the Dominican Republic for 30 years, watching players come back. And and Darby and Adams and Liston also pointed out that on the contrary, that release, they looked at it in terms of Bourdieu, the idea of a second birth, that release is not built out of nothing. It's built out of X amount of time spent playing in various leagues, maybe in various countries. And there were certain skill sets that were attained that made the likelihood of getting employment after their career highly feasible. Everybody in their sample was hired in relatively short order as a result, in part or whole, of their having had that set of experiences. And Joe mentions it and kind of implies that when he talks about cultural fluidity of these migrants. Those kinds of experiences don't just die when the player's career is over. They can be translated into a whole set of opportunities. In the Dominican Republic, we saw people coming back who, as a result of having gained a measure of English, some good, some not so good, but a measure of English, and having been around North Americans in various organizations, began to open up businesses that are related to baseball. Like one guy had a laundry and he did all the laundry for all the academies, all the baseball academies on the island. There was a lot of baseball academies, American baseball academies. And as a result of that, he was able to take his understanding of how to work with Americans, a little bit of English, and build it into a business. Other guys became employees of various sorts for various major league organizations. So the idea of a return migration, as Darby and Liston point out, a return migration or a second birth is an important component of agency. It disappears from our view because we generally stop looking at our athletes once they stop migrating. And when they come back home at the end of their career, it's just a void. So I thought that was a particularly valuable little contribution. I'll go back to you, Christian.
Many thanks, Alan. Well, actually, to look at careers from a whole career perspective, that includes aspirations to actual careers, also the aspiration of migration, how the migration takes place, but also post-playing migration careers. I think that's really important, and that's what I would also stress. Thanks a lot. Actually, Joseph and Mark, you have the chance to react to some of the comments that Carmen and Alan made, but also from the audience, if there is still some questions, just chip in and raise it. So I think we have some 5 or 10 minutes before we close the meeting.
Well, just to say both thank you to Alan and Carmen for those comments and observations. Yeah, it is simply not only the handbook, but the field. We're a symptom of a beginning. In other words, that this is not the end point. This is a process of knowledge accumulation. And there will be things which have been underestimated or underplayed. There are, to quote Donald Rumsfeld, if I may, there are known knowns, there are known unknowns, and I'm sure there are unknown unknowns in this area of research, which we will, follow in the decades or so ahead. And what we've produced so far is, and I'm talking about myself, is only at best an approximation of the truth, so it is a contribution to knowledge in that regard. I learned a lot from reading the chapters of the contributors. And so that process, along with when you supervise either former PhD students who publish in this handbook or when they are PhD students themselves, the eerily crazy thing, and those of us old enough to have grown-up kids will know, is that you eventually also, I hope, learn from your children. And there is a segue here, which I'm coming to, is that one of my sons actually is an assistant professor in intelligence and security studies. And in listening to him, how and in what ways he tries to, in a sense, capture what goes on is a lesson I've learned in terms of how and in what ways we were talking about how to study the power elite. I do remember, and this goes back to being with Mark Falcous in Otago in Dunedin, happened to sit next to the French ambassador to New Zealand. And I adopted the not knowing approach and asking him, and this was in the build up to the London Olympic Games. I'll cut short the example, but what he basically said is that, and he said, he thought I was British rather than I'm actually Irish. But he said, your security service was better than ours. And then that immediately triggered a whole series of tell me more. And what was quite interesting was the extent to which the bidding for those Olympic Games was actually driven by MI6, that's the external secret service of the UK, in order to establish dossiers on every member of the IOC who would be voting for London or Barcelona or Paris in those games. And as it turned out, of course, London won, and the French ambassador said, you guys were better than us, right? That reveals to me something also, which I've spoken to Alan about, which relates to how and in what ways, both in the past, but also in the present, the interconnection, not only between the surveillance which goes on through the sort of sports analytics, but I'm talking about the surveillance of activity around stadia, of fans, of players, and so forth, but also of the role of intelligence and security services more generally in migration processes. And that's something which goes back to Christian's point. This is not simply a study of sport migration, it's the study of migration through the lens of sport.
Mhm.
Over to you, Mark.
Mhm.
Thanks, Joe. Yeah, thank you to Alan and Carmen for those comments. Obviously, it's actually very interesting to hear what people take of interest from it, and that I won't be too long here, but the hope with the collection really is that, of course, it's a conversation starter, and it does ignite those bits of conversation. So everyone will have their various little elements in different chapters because it is so broad, that they will take interest from, and hopefully that will be the spark for future work and ongoing dialogue. And just last comment, because I know you're going to open up, Christian. I just think it is very nice to have this dialogue because we've got a lot of people around the table here that are voices in this broader conversation, and the more we can do this, the better.
That's definitely true. I think I can underline that. I saw many familiar faces, but also a lot of new names, not faces, actually. But I agree that that was a great opportunity to start up the conversation. I mean, it was called the discussion of a handbook, but I think we moved beyond that. And it's actually important not only to discuss existing works, but also to think collectively in a format like this, how to move on. And I think there were some really good ideas. Joseph, thank you for this, for how to bring the field forward, what topics, what approaches are important. And I think the handbook can be read as, like not only as a state-of-the-art piece for the field, but also like an agenda setting contribution. What are emerging themes that we should discuss in the near future, in the near or middle future, before the next handbook is published. So we want the next handbook to be a unique and one which comes up with novel themes, approaches, and possibly locations, new researches, and so on. So I'm definitely looking forward to that.
Christian, if
Yeah.
I might, I won't be longer, I promise. I know with my
No problem.
sometimes I take twice the time I should. But I just want to say that I love the book. I learned a lot with the book. And when Christian first invited me, I said, I don't know what to do because we are not used to this kind of meeting. We do meetings like that with authors that are preparing a book, but we do not talk with them after the book is released. So my comments maybe was appropriated for a book that was going to be released and not the one that was ready. And I liked it very much. And also I learned a lot today in our conversation. Thank you, Christian, for organizing this. And thank you, Mark, Joseph, Kate, and Alan. And I'm sorry, I have comments for all chapters, but I follow our chief here, that is Christian, and he just asked some questions. So I will be very glad to send the text to Nijorai, Elliot, and Adams. I have so, and Gross. I like I have comments for you too. Sorry, Christian.
Yeah, thank you, Carmen. I never meant to cut you short, so you should have all the time in the world to spread your word. And that brings me to the listserv. Use the new listserv. We introduced it last week. You can share also information and initiate discussions there. Okay, I think we call it a day now. That gives me the chance to really thank Joseph, Katie, and Mark for their participation. I really enjoyed it, and I hope the rest of you too. I really want to thank you, Carmen and Alan, for your contributions. And I really want to thank the audience of participating in this first edition of book discussions of the network. And I hope that many others will follow. So if you have a book out, please do let us know. We will not only post it to the listserv and put it on our website, we'll make sure that we'll have the chance to discuss it in a format like this. That will be great. So yeah, stay tuned for more information, but not only stay tuned, but also engage with the network, initiate discussions, let us know about things that are going on. And that will bring not only the network forward, but I think that will also contribute to the field of sport and migration. Thanks a lot. Have a nice morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are, and see you safe and sound in a not so distant future. Bye-bye.
Thank you.